Hello, everyone. Thank you for your patience. Much appreciated. There we go. Right. I think by now everybody knows I am Dr. Liz Watts-Maluhos of the Illinois State Archaeological Survey. I'm the section head of collaborative research engagement here at ISAS. Welcome. Thank you for our first evening lecture. We're super excited to see you. This is the last in the series this spring, but we're so excited you could join us this evening. I will be the moderator for tonight's lecture, and on behalf of the organizer of the series, Dr. Erin Benson, again, welcome and thank you for joining us. Like I said, tonight is the last installment of the 2024 Spring Series, and this year we focused on collaborative research, and so it was perfect to have a lecture today by Dr. Joseph Galloy, Robert White III, and Miranda Yancey, and we're so excited to have them. This series is being supported by funds from the Office of the State Archaeologist and ISAS's Collaborative Research Engagement section. ISAS is a division of the Prairie Research Institute at the University of Illinois. And we have about 70 full-time archaeologists and support staff working throughout the state, which makes ISAS one of the largest archaeological research institutions in the U.S. ISAS also recognizes that our offices at the University of Illinois campus in Urbana-Champaign and across the state are on the lands of the Delaware, Ho-Chunk, Iowa, Kaw, Kickapoo, Miami, Menominee, Meskwaki, Odawa, Ojibwe, Omaha, Osage, Oto, Missouri, Peoria, Ponca, Potawatomi, Quapaw, Sauk, Shawnee, Winnebago, and other Native nations. ISAS acknowledges the histories of forced removals of these nations from their homelands and dispossession from their cultural sites and material culture. ISAS is committed to building partnerships and collaborating with Native nations on the steady protection and promotion of their cultural heritage across the state. On behalf of the state archaeologist and director of ISAS, Dr. Timothy Pocketat, today we are honored to host tonight's speakers. Dr. Joseph Galloy is the Cultural Resource Unit Manager and Chief Archaeologist for the Illinois Department of Transportation. Robert White III grew up in Brooklyn, Illinois in the 1980s and is the president of the Historical Society of Brooklyn, Illinois. And Miranda Yancey is the Archaeological Site Files Technician at the Illinois State Museum. I will now turn it over to Joe, Miranda, and Robert, but please make sure to submit questions and comments in the chat, and we'll have a brief question and answer discussion after the lecture. Okay.
All right.
Stop sharing in just a sec.
All right. Is this screen visible? Great.
Yep, you can see it.
Well, thank you, Liz. I would like to say thank you to ISAS for inviting the three of us here today to talk about collaborative research in Brooklyn, Illinois, America's first Black town. This has been a very rewarding project for everybody involved. And I think it's a really neat example of collaborative research that grew organically. We didn't set out to do this, it just kind of happened. And so today what we're going to do is just walk through the history of Brooklyn, Illinois. We're going to talk a little bit about how the collaborative research project started, what its goals are, and how archaeology, and in particular ISAS's involvement historically with this project has been part of the story of building this relationship and learning more about Brooklyn's history. And then we'll look a little bit at some of the things that the project has been able to accomplish. And we'll also look at some of the challenges Brooklyn faces in terms of historic preservation. And then we'll take a little look at some things that are coming up. So with that, I'm going to advance to the next slide and turn it over to Miranda.
Hello. So just a quick introduction. The small town of Brooklyn, Illinois is a nationally significant town, and it was formed as a refuge community and as an early example of Black self-determination in the United States. The town is located about 2 miles north of East St. Louis in St. Clair County, Illinois, and it formed directly across from the river town of St. Louis, Missouri. According to past researchers, on July 30th, 1873, Brooklyn became the first majority Black town in the United States to officially vote to incorporate. The oral tradition of the town states that it began as a squatter settlement formed by escaped and former slaves in 1829. The earliest historic records for Brooklyn date to the platting of two separate towns, Brooklyn in 1837 and Upper Brooklyn in 1839. Today, these towns are incorporated into the single village of Brooklyn. At the beginning, Upper Brooklyn and Lower Brooklyn formed as a biracial town. However, throughout the 19th century, a Black majority grew. And Joe, if you could advance to the next slide.
Sure.
Despite the odds and the collapse of industry and good jobs in the vicinity, Brooklyn has survived. Not only is Brooklyn the only remaining early African-American settlement out of a few that were established in the greater St. Louis region, but it is also one of only a handful of 19th century Black towns in the United States that still remain. Go to the next slide, please. The town matriarch, Priscilla Baltimore, is even referred to as Harriet Tubman of the West, as Brooklyn was an important stop on the Underground Railroad. Oral tradition states that it was Priscilla who led Black settlers to Brooklyn in 1829. The first historical record of Priscilla residing in Brooklyn dates to 1839, and she lived in Brooklyn for decades before moving back to St. Louis late in life. Priscilla Baltimore was born a slave in Bourbon County, Kentucky around 1801. Her father was her master, and he sold her downriver when she was a child. Eventually, she became the slave of a Methodist minister who allowed her to purchase her freedom. At this time, Priscilla tracked down her father, now in Missouri, and purchased her mother's freedom. At that time, the two settled in St. Louis to live. Priscilla Baltimore worked on the riverboats and as a ladies' nurse. She was devoted to the AME Church, or African Methodist Episcopal Church, throughout her life. She was also very well known in the greater St. Louis region. At the time of her death, there were large articles about her life printed in the St. Louis newspapers. Additionally, there was an announcement of her death in Harper's Bazaar. Next slide.
Brooklyn's 19th century history was quite interesting. But as folks who live in Brooklyn today know, and people in the area, Brooklyn also has a really interesting story to tell in the 20th century. And the town had several prominent people who were well known on the national stage. Robert, did you want to comment about any of these individuals?
Joe, thank you. Good afternoon, all. My name is Robert White, president of the Historical Society of Brooklyn, Illinois. As I look at this slide, I'm truly honored to have at least come in contact and had some interaction with at least three of these individuals, three of these prominent Brooklynites. One in the person of Mr. Prince Joe Henry, who was a famous Negro League baseball player. I would often see as a young child, I can recall walking to school, Mr. Joe Henry would be out on his front porch drinking coffee. He had a really big dog. I think it was a German Shepherd, but he was a really, really honorable, really friendly man. Also, Hamiet Blewett. Hamiet Blewett was a prominent baritone saxophonist, member of the World Saxophone Quartet. In his latter years, Hamiet actually lived in a house across the street directly across the street from the house that I grew up in. Um, and then you have Mr. Albert King. I didn't know Albert King personally, but I can recall my mother telling me many stories of Mr. Albert King, no relation to B.B. King, um, who was a prominent musician. And my mother would often tell stories of how he would practice. She lived about 500 yards from Mr. Albert King. And when he wasn't on the road, he would practice. And so she would get free concerts at least once a week while he was practicing. And then you have the lovely Miss Annie Turnbow Malone, who is a staple in the St. Louis community, so much so that she has a parade named after her, the Annie Malone Parade, which will happen, I think, the weekend of May 19th. It's the second largest African American parade in the country. And there are many more prominent Brooklynites that may not have the big names in the limelights, but these are a few that we hang our hats on and that we're proud of.
Thank you, Robert. As I mentioned before, the Brooklyn Public Engagement Program was something that kind of began by accident. In 2007, I was working as the site director for a site known as the Janie B. Good site. It's a site that is fairly well known among regional archaeologists as being particularly rich. Site that dates from somewhere around, it's a indigenous site, dates from about roughly AD 600 or so up until about 1400, and was one of the locations of one of the largest excavations ever performed in the country. And in 2007, we were winding down. And one day I was in the field, kind of along the side of the road, and a couple of people pulled up and got out and asked what we were doing. And this was not unusual. We did have visitors that were interested in what was going on. But in this case, the couple of folks that were asking about our activities turned out to be the couple of people that started the Brooklyn Historical Society. Roberta Rogers was one. Ronnie Steele was another, and they were in town for a funeral. And Roberta's really fascinated by what we were doing. She asked lots of questions. She wanted to record, what I was saying, so she could kind of soak it all in and take it back home. And she lives in Texas. And so after she got back home to Texas, she started researching more about Brooklyn's history. She had been born in Brooklyn, raised in Brooklyn. But like many people, we often grow up not really knowing a heck of a lot about the communities that we live in. We don't know a lot about their history. And she was really intrigued by Brooklyn's story, that it was the first Black town founded in the United States, the first incorporated Black town. The story of Priscilla Baltimore really interested her. And her enthusiasm started a process by which she started recruiting other members of the community to support the founding of the Historical Society of Brooklyn, Illinois. And the Historical Society has been the vehicle for all of this public engagement program's achievements. The Historical Society has been in the driver's seat, typically throughout this time, 2007 to present. We've been, those of us who are supporting the program have been listening to the community and finding out what their priorities are, and then trying to apply our expertise in archaeology and history to advance their goals. And from my perspective as an archaeologist, where oftentimes my work is driven by laws or regulations or perhaps personal interest, In this case, we were taken on a journey that was being led by people who were trying to explore their own past, something that had really deep meaning to them. And so this I view as a really happy accident, this kind of chance encounter of a couple of people at, an archaeological dig that turned into something much, much bigger. And I'm going to go to the next slide and let Robert outline what the goals of the Historical Society are. These goals were set back in the beginning with the vision of the founders of the Historical Society of what they wanted to accomplish.
You, Joe. Excuse me, all. I'm navigating some challenges with my voice. Can you all hear me? Hopefully, you can hear
Can hear
me.
you.
One crucial goal of the Historical Society of Brooklyn, Illinois, was the historic preservation of the cemetery in Brooklyn, Illinois. As I understand it, it is the oldest Black cemetery west of the Allegheny Mountains. And so it was important to us to make sure that we are in a position that we're working with organizations like ISAS to preserve the cemetery. Another crucial aspect of uh, Brooklyn's Historical Societies of Brooklyn's work is the retelling of our history. Unfortunately, excuse me. All right, hopefully that helps. 1 second, please. All right, let's try this again. So unfortunately, okay. All right. So for the third time, and I'll try to be as brief as possible, but it's important that for us, that we highlight Brooklyn in a positive light. Here recently, I would say in the past 30 years or so, Brooklyn hasn't always been represented in the most honorable way. And we recognize that Brooklyn has a long, rich history. And so one of the goals is to make sure that that history gets out and that some of the conditions that Brooklyn face now doesn't overshadow that rich, long tradition of Brooklynites. The third goal was really to really about setting out to embark upon heritage-based community development in the shape of establishing a monument, looking at things like the development of a museum, so that people, once we're gone, people will know that Brooklyn was a prominent place and won't be wiped away from history.
Thank you, Robert. So how can archaeology help support the goals of the Historical Society? Just as a general statement, most of what happened in the past is unrecorded. And in a place like Brooklyn, which began as a refuge community, we would expect that a lot of the details about the very beginnings of Brooklyn would not be represented in the documents. And in fact, that's one thing that that we did find. Miranda had done considerable research, Roberta as well, looking for deeds, tax records, and census records, and found that look in the very earliest days of Brooklyn's existence, let's say 1830 to 1840 or so, there's very fragmentary and sometimes contradictory information in the documentary record about what was going on. And so archaeology is one way that we could try to fill in some of the gaps about Brooklyn's history. One of those goals that we had early on was to see if we could try to locate where the Freedom Village was, the original settlement of roughly about 12 families. And, you know, trying to locate that was in a large town, or not that large, but is a very large area to survey, was a bit of a challenge. And we'll look at how we did that in a little bit. But we also wanted to see if we could locate where the Freedom Village was, if we can understand how it transformed from what might be thought of as a squatter community into a formally platted town. What was that process? And then last, one of the goals of the archaeological work, it's an ongoing goal, has not yet been achieved, is to help list Brooklyn in the National Register of Historic Places. One of the problems that we faced, we had some discussions with the State Historic Preservation Office, their National Register Office, was how to list Brooklyn. It's a very historical place, but how do we get it listed in the register? And one of the challenges we faced is that there is really no architecture that relates to the earliest part of Brooklyn's history, or even really the pre-Civil War part of Brooklyn's history. So we're missing that physical marker on the landscape that is often necessary to for a National Register listing. And so we thought that one additional avenue that would be available to us would be to list Brooklyn as an archaeological site. And so our goal was to see if we could locate the Freedom Village and see what kind of potential for archaeological deposits to exist in the town, what that potential was. So in 2008, we spent a couple of weeks doing the work you could see here in the lower left-hand part of the slide. We were using post hole diggers to try to sample the original topsoil of the ground to see if we could find artifacts relating to this early part of Brooklyn's history, primarily focusing on the pre-Civil War era. One challenge that we did have was that Brooklyn has had an awful lot of fill brought in to help raise the streets and the yards. Of course, we're not very far from the Mississippi River. Back in the 19th century, Brooklyn was immediately adjacent to the Mississippi. In fact, that was part of the lifeblood of the town, was work associated with the river. And that condition led to a lot of problems with flooding when it would rain and so on. So Brooklynites who are in their 60s and 70s and older can recall, I've been told directly by one or two people that they remember dump truck loads of dirt being brought in to help fill and raise the streets and the yards. So we had to penetrate that fill to get down to the original ground surface and sample that small area. These post hole diggers can't sample a very large area. And then try to look for artifacts relating to this early part of Brooklyn's history. Our strategy included an examination of historical documents to try to identify where the earliest Afro-Brooklynites had settled. And this was compiled using census records and so on. Some of the information that we used was from old oral histories that have been recorded about who the earliest families were. And we put all that stuff together to identify a couple dozen lots that we wanted to try to survey. And in the right-hand part of the slide, you could see the entire platted town of Brooklyn, the upper part of the site, which is platted as Upper Brooklyn. I don't know if any of you could see my mouse, but I'm drawing a line here along the edge of what was platted as Upper Brooklyn right here. This coincides with an old land claim, and that's why it's got this odd diagonal that cuts through these lots. We found that Upper Brooklyn was the primary concentration of the earliest African American residents of the town. So the lots that you see coded in green or yellow, we had targeted for archaeological survey using this post-hole digging method. In some areas, we found that we couldn't penetrate the historic fill. Either it was too gravelly to get through, or there might be buried asphalt or some other reason that we couldn't penetrate the fills. But for the most part, we were successful in getting onto an awful lot of lots. The ones that are in yellow are lots that we were able to survey. The ones that were in green were ones we identified as likely or ideal places to survey based on the occupation of the lots in the pre-Civil War era, but we were unable to survey for a variety of reasons. I'm going to call out right here in the if you could see my mouse, the sort of upper or the bottom part of Upper Brooklyn right here. There's a very small lot with a star on it. We had discovered that was the location of Priscilla Baltimore's house lot. And even though we didn't survey that at the time, we were able to get back to it at a later point in time and do some testing there. So we were digging for about a week, concentrating on the eastern part of town and moving west. And Roberta was interested in what we were finding, and I talked to her on the phone every other day or so, and I was telling her that we really weren't finding anything. Almost everything below the historic fill was post-Civil War, and I was getting pretty discouraged. But towards the end of about a week or so, we started finding some pre-Civil War era artifacts in this western part of Upper Brooklyn. And in fact, right here, the intersection of 3rd, Short, and 4th Streets, there were some lots where we found these pieces of English teacups and plates and things like that dated from that time period that we were interested in. So we decided to target that area for some additional work. In one of 2 test units that we dug, these are 1 by 1 meter or 3 by 3 foot squares, we found additional materials dating from the pre-Civil War era. It's actually hard to see in this slide because it's a little cut off, but these, you could see a line here. These are different levels of fill that were present above the original topsoil. This dark stain you can see here is actually a rodent burrow, so it's not meaningful. But when we got down to the natural subsoil underneath the topsoil, we could see a faint rectangular discolored area that we knew had to be made by people. And so we decided to sample a small portion of this. And what you can see outlined in red here is the cultural deposit, or the feature we call it, that contained things like these fragments you can see in the upper right-hand part of the screen, small fragment of brick, some very thin pieces of window glass, a teacup foot ring, and a piece of a medicine vial. And we interpreted this deposit as possibly the corner of a cellar. This would be a subfloor cellar that would go underneath a frame house, let's say. And while this wasn't a smoking gun, it told us that, in terms of the Freedom Village, that we had possibly found the Freedom Village, we at least knew that we had intact pre-Civil War archaeological deposits. In this case, we believe the cellar probably dates to about the 1830s, 1840s or so. So right around the time of the Freedom Village and the platting of the town. And it encouraged us to think that probably through this needle in a haystack approach of post hole digging, we had just happened to come across an archaeological deposit that is intact and that would help us support an eventual National Register nomination for Brooklyn. In 2014, we embarked on a exploration of Priscilla Baltimore's house lot. We took out heavy equipment and stripped all of the overburden off the site or off of this particular lot. It actually had asphalt and other things that we couldn't penetrate when we were doing shovel testing or the post hole testing. And we found about a dozen archaeological features, like you see in the upper right-hand part of the slide. It's a old privy shaft or outhouse shaft. And we dug these and we found materials consistent with late 19th century occupation. You could see an 1876, I believe, dime, a bitters bottle, a medicinal patent medicine bottle, soda bottle, things like that. And while we had hoped that we would find evidence that was directly linked to Priscilla Baltimore, artifacts that might relate to her life, it instead appeared that all of the archaeological deposits had been basically placed in these holes. Most of them were outhouse holes after she had left the site, very likely immediately after she sold the lot and went back to St. Louis. So in addition to the archaeology, there are other things that we have done on the project that we'd like to highlight now. One of them being the relocation of Priscilla Baltimore's gravesite in Bellefontaine Cemetery. And I'll turn it over to Miranda.
Yeah, so that was an early success. Previously, it wasn't known where Priscilla was buried, and we ended up locating her burial records and finding her grave location in Bellefontaine Cemetery. This grave was unmarked, but by 2010, the Historical Society had raised the funds to place a marker stone there. And there was a ceremony unveiling the stone, and it was covered by St. Louis media organizations. So it was some good positive press coverage and getting the story of Priscilla Baltimore out to the public. Yeah, and then later in 2013, the Quinn Chapel African Methodist Episcopal Church in Brooklyn was successfully listed on the National Park Service's Network to Freedom program. This program recognizes sites with a verifiable connection to the Underground Railroad. The Quinn Chapel is perhaps the oldest AME church in Illinois. There's some writers that say up by Chicago, other people say Brooklyn. But anyway, it was constructed and founded in 1839 by Priscilla Baltimore and William Paul Quinn, who was a famous AME preacher and abolitionist. The first church building of Quinn Chapel was also constructed by Jordan Winston Early, who was another AME preacher and a known active participant in the Underground Railroad. And just so you know, in general, the AME church was known as the Abolition Church.
The public engagement program generated some additional positive press coverage other than the things that we've already discussed. There's been quite a bit of interest in Brooklyn and its history. In, I believe it was about 2008, 2009, the Illinois State Museum had an exhibit on Lincoln's, Illinois. And the museum requested some artifacts from Brooklyn, the ones that you had seen earlier, to be put on display as part of that exhibit. Miranda and I published an article in Illinois Antiquity, a newsletter of the Illinois Association for Advancement of Archaeology. And Brooklyn's past has been featured on radio. Miranda and I went on Radio Arts Foundation, a classical station in St. Louis. I think it has a different name now, actually, along with former Mayor O'Bannon, who was instrumental in getting this program off the ground. and we were there for a talk show episode. St. Louis Public Radio did a story on our exploration of Priscilla Baltimore's house lot. And that was, even though it was a local story, it was picked up all around the country. And I had relatives in South Carolina that said, "Hey, we heard this story on the radio." WGN also did a piece on Brooklyn, television piece that was probably, I don't know, about 10 years ago or so. And the media interest continues to this day. There's always inquiries that are coming into the Historical Society primarily. And so it's really helping to achieve that goal of a positive press coverage and telling a different story than the one that people are often exposed to about Brooklyn in the mainstream media. So we'll end with looking at the future of Brooklyn's past, what Brooklyn faces in terms of challenges, and then also some of the planned work that that we all have for Brooklyn. Robert, if your voice is cooperating, I could turn this slide over to you.
All righty, let's see. So one of the biggest projects that the Historical Society of Brooklyn is currently embarking on is we have, historical record of what Brooklyn was going back to the early 1830s. One of the things that we thought was important was to capture the narratives of elders that are still alive in Brooklyn to talk about a more recent history. We're looking to embark upon interviewing residents that are in their 70s, 80s, even 90s. We recently did an interview with someone, a famous Brooklynite that recently passed away. I think about 3 weeks after we did that interview. There's an old African proverb says that when an elder dies, you lose a librarian. So we want to capture as much of the history, the recent history, as we can, and allow people to control the narrative that they want to share with the world.
Robert, is that part of the, I know, Miranda, you've been working on that Illinois Digital Archive. I don't know if capturing the elder stories is part of that, or if that's perhaps something a little different.
Well, the Illinois State Digital Archives has expressed interest in hosting these narratives on their website once we complete them. So hopefully in the future, they'll be available for other researchers and also just residents of the town that are interested in learning about the past from elders. In addition, the Smithsonian has been interested in Brooklyn research recently, and they're going to be coming back in the fall to help digitize records and possibly host those as well.
Yeah, Robert and Miranda and I sat down with some of those folks from the Smith Center at the Smithsonian, and this, gosh, I can't remember the exact name of this. Well, it's called the Community Curation Program. They've been around for a while, several years now, going to different towns, and the goal is to record and digitize and preserve documents and audio-visual records for community members. These things are not necessarily going to go in any sort of repository. The main goal of this community curation program is to help preserve media that are not necessarily stable so that they can be passed down for future generations. And so that's coming to St. Louis in the fall of 2024. And Brooklyn has already been part of organizing for that. I'm going to skip back to this other slide here and just point out one recent development was that Landmarks Illinois, which is a historic preservation organization, advocacy group, every year names 10 properties to their most endangered historic places list. And in May of 2023, they took the unusual step of putting Brooklyn, Illinois on the 10 most endangered historic places list. And this came primarily because the Historical Society was trying to get the word out that Brooklyn faces some challenges in terms of preserving its history, declining population, limited economy and tax base, and then also the acquisition of house lots within the town by the surrounding railroads, which historically cut off a lot of the economic activity of the town. That was threatening the community as a whole, its existence as a community, and also threatens some of the archaeological deposits in the town as well. And so this nomination to this list, or listing on this endangered list, helped to sort of sound the alarm that Brooklyn has an important past. It's worth preserving, and steps need to be taken to make that happen. And then I'll end on a happy note that we do plan, ISAS and the Historical Society plan on doing more archaeological investigations in the Freedom Village area that we were looking at before. Roberta Rogers has been pretty active in trying to acquire property in the town so that the town's history can be preserved, and also provide an opportunity to do some further exploration to help again strengthen that case for nominating Brooklyn to the National Register. And with that, that's the end of our presentation. I think next we turn to questions.
Yes, that sounds great. Thank you very much, Joe, Robert, Miranda. Robert, I'm sorry your voice went out. We super appreciate you coming, even though you probably are feeling under the weather, and giving everything a go. So yeah, we have a few questions rolling in. I'm going to start with my own because I'm curious. Were you able to have any geophysics done in the Freedom Village prior to sort of that first round of excavations?
No, we didn't do it, and we hadn't really seriously considered it at the time, mainly because of all that fill that's out there. It's actually pretty thick, and that's something I've discussed recently with Tom Label at ISAS, is the possibility of maybe doing some geophysical work on some of the lots, just to see what results we might get, and if they it might be a useful way of exploring some of the lots without having to dig.
Absolutely. I know there are several folks from ISAS. You've got the right audience here that are extremely interested in supporting this project, of course, and getting more involved. And I know several folks would be really interested in participating in geophysics if that's something that we could pursue. So that was just my own own question about something specific that ISAS could do. But I have a great question about, are there ways that folks can contribute to preservation efforts more generally, either by donating, volunteering, or advocating?
Yeah, I think, Robert, do you have thoughts on that?
My apologies, I got a bit distracted. I was looking at a comment. So can you repeat the question?
That's no problem. It was just a general question if there are ways that folks can contribute to broader preservation efforts, either by donating, volunteering, or advocating.
Yeah, that is definitely a possibility. I will be completely vulnerable. I am new to the leadership of the Historical Society, so that would be a conversation I would love. I don't know fully what that could look like. So I would love to entertain some of those conversations and lean in on some of the expertise of Joe and Miranda, as well as extended network, to see what those possibilities could look like and what their need is.
I will say while we're chatting, I can, I'll find the link for the Historical Society of Brooklyn website, which I think at least at one point it had a way to maybe donate,
Yep,
or at least
absolutely.
have other further information for anybody that wants to follow up. So be doing that as we're chatting. And I have another question. Has the Historical Society of Brooklyn received support from state or other official entities, or is there anyone that you are? Oh, thank you for coming in with that, Linda, with the link. It is in the chat. Thank you. Or if there are sort of state institutions or official entities you think would be particularly helpful that we could help advocate for.
So in response to the first part of your question, it's primarily been private benefactors and private donors that we've received support from. Again, I think that we're open to all possibilities. I don't know the specific areas, departments, but we're open. And what I'll do is I will leave my contact information in the chat, so if folks want to reach out as well.
Excellent. Thank you. And I realized that Linda had sent that link just to me. So then I shared it with everybody. So now it should be in the chat. We've got a comment in the chat. This was great. Thank you so much for this and the other lectures in the series. My comment is, or question is, how their approach to public engagement is exactly how we should be working with our state's traditional custodians. Or I guess that was a comment. This is a great example for engagement in public archaeology and history. Thank you, Dale, for that comment. And let's see. Sorry, I'm troubleshooting questions back and forth. Oh, here's a good one. Have there been any surprises or really unexpected findings about Brooklyn's history that have emerged from the archaeology or the archival research and historical research that you've been doing, Miranda?
Really just, I think the most fascinating thing for me that I've encountered has just been uncovering Priscilla Baltimore's story. We've got a lot of historic records, and she did go through a divorce, so we have some very detailed divorce papers from 1856 where she describes her life and the property that she owns. And she's just such an inspirational figure, and I would love for her story to get out there so she can be recognized.
Yeah, I think most of the surprises have been on the documents side, more so than the archaeology side. Priscilla's divorce papers helped clue us into her house lot, so they revealed that, answered that question. Contained a lot of fairly dramatic details of the circumstances of her divorce and her home life, and kind of added some. It gave some additional depth to her story that I think hadn't been previously known. I think, Miranda, you had also encountered some information in a court case that referred back to Brooklyn in its early days, and it was somebody recalling a memory that suggested that the town was fairly substantial in its numbers. That really wasn't reflected in the official records.
Yes, yeah. There was a court case over land because they had done work in the Mississippi River to save the St. Louis port. And as a result of this, Brooklyn lost its riverfront position, and soil accretions built up. And eventually this land was being disputed. So they were going back to who originally would have had a claim to the land. And in that, there's testimony by one of the surveyors who laid out the plots, and he describes it early on as being a really active town with, a few hundred people living there already.
I have a good sort of follow-up or related question to this. Are there direct descendants of the original settlers of Brooklyn still in Brooklyn, or have there been attempts to contact and involve those descendants?
Not that we've found, I know for Priscilla herself, it doesn't seem that she ever had any children of her own. She was always taking in children, and she did have an adopted grandson that there are references to in the records, but he unfortunately died at a young age before having children. So, but as far as some of the other founding families, that's something I would like to look into to see if we can find descendants somewhere.
There actually are descendants still in Brooklyn of those 12 founding families.
Yeah, I can't remember the source, but a week or two ago, I was digging through some old records and doing some reading online and came across, I forget which family it was, but it identified a particular family as being descended from some of the founding families. I think a great many people in Brooklyn today, trace their roots to the South and the Great Migration. But I think it's kind of fascinating that Brooklyn, despite the fact that there was a large influx of new residents, it always maintained its character as a special place, that identity as a special place.
And I said someone, if anybody knows this off the top of your head, what the current population of Brooklyn is?
So it is just over 600 residents.
Okay, thank you. And then I see Robert put his contact information and information about donations and support in the chat. So if you're interested, please check that out right now. And perhaps do a quick copy and paste as we're sort of wrapping up the evening. I will leave it to our speakers if they have any last comments. Before I wrap up, this was really, really wonderful. A small tidbit about my history, and Joe and Miranda know this, but years ago when I was starting out as an archaeological field technician at ISAS, in its previous iteration as ITARP, I actually got to assist Joe on the shovel test survey of that initial survey of the Freedom Village. I talked to some of the community members and ended up helping with one of the cemetery cleanups one weekend, maybe an initial one, and it was just a really wonderful experience and really formative in the way that I think about engaging communities and working on collaborative projects. So thank you for sort of letting me be a part of the beginning of this project in that way. And it's been just absolutely amazing to be able to circle back. And I'm so looking forward to the future of partnership between our speakers and ISAS and any ways that ISAS can help serve the Historical Society of Brooklyn, Illinois. We're really looking forward to doing that and figuring out that path with you all. So just wanted to say big thanks. Now, if my official thanks to wrap up, and let me actually share my screen with the slide for everyone for the official wrap up. On behalf of the Prairie Research Institute, the Illinois State Archaeological Survey, and the Office of the State Archaeologist, thank you to Joe, Miranda, and Robert, and thank you all for joining us this evening. This lecture, again, is recorded and it'll be posted on the ISAS YouTube page with the rest of this spring series and our other speaker series from years past. So again, thank you for joining us. Have a wonderful evening, and we will see you all in the future, maybe for another speaker series. We'll see. So thanks again. Have a good one.
Thank you.
Thank you.